It's April 25th. Happy birthday, Dakota. The class has a message for you. Okay, and if you haven't deleted your subscription to my YouTube channel after that, happy birthday. And we're going to move on. I'm going to show you very quickly the phrase of the day from yesterday, which I failed to record because I had a technical difficulty. So you guys have seen it. Emma, you've seen it now. It's on the missed work form. Dakota and Emma. The purpose was to incorporate a couple third declension nouns, salus and lex, which most people saw last year in Latin 1 phrases of the day as we were doing state mottos. I give you guys another familiar Latin phrase that incorporates a third declension noun. It is the noun dux. Anyone have a recollection of who this person is? It is Dido. Okay. And you can see in the shadows what's in her left hand? The sword that Aeneas left behind. Okay. And she's looking off into the future as the goddess Iris, the goddess of the rainbow, is appearing. And this is the moment of Dido's death, which is not what I want you guys to think of. I want you to think about how in an early part of the Aeneid, and by the way, some of you might consider this to be borderline review for the final exam. Not that I want to mention that. Okay. Aeneas was greeted on the shores of North Africa by his disguised mother, who told Aeneas, Venus told Aeneas about Dido. And in Venus's narration of Dido and how she came to be in North Africa, Venus said, Dux femina facti. In theory, you guys know what dux is, right? It means leader. And according to Lesson 40's vocab list, dux is a masculine noun. There's something of a paradox going on because what's the next word? Femina, which means woman. And Venus is saying, paradoxically for the ancient world, a woman was the leader of the deed, or a woman was a leader of the thing done. The thing done, or the deed, was bringing the Phoenicians from their neck of the woods in the eastern Mediterranean across North Africa into Carthage. All right, so phrase of the day. Questions there? Yes. It's implied. You're going to come to experience a lot in Latin 3 and Latin 4 situations where the author chooses not to incorporate a verb, a form of the verb be. Okay? It's like saying, Joey, he crazy. Okay? Joey, he into girls.
He already is.
Sorry, I mean, I'm quoting him on that. Don't know whether you should believe. And okay, remember that the strict definition of the cursus honorum was 3 elected offices. The strict definition of cursus honorum, 3 elected offices that in sequence from bottom to top, an ambitious Roman would seek to hold to complete his political career or to hold power in Rome. And the numbers of people elected annually decreased as you went up the cursus honorum, and power was concentrated, greater power was concentrated in fewer hands. At the bottom of the official cursus honorum was the position of quaestor. Again, 20 guys elected annually. They oversaw taxation and finances, either in Rome itself or They were assigned to Rome's various conquered provinces to oversee taxation and finances there. Under the authority of their superior magistrates, they collected taxes, paid for military operations, and funded some public projects, public works projects. Yes. Yes, and Emma, you're not thinking quite as expansively as I need you to. Talking about the strict 3 offices in the cursus honorum, okay, that an ambitious Roman of senatorial family would start with. But there were other offices that were optional, including the tribune of the plebs, which we'll talk about more as we go on, that someone who wasn't of a senatorial family might start with. All right, again, late in the Republic, minimum age was set for most of the elected offices. Well, you know, the funny thing is that the end of the Republic was brought about by the naming of a guy named Octavian as consul at the age of 19. So yeah, it is not good to have 18 or 19-year-olds in charge. And, okay, all right, yeah. Free Game Boys for everyone. Or, I'm sorry, Game Boys are so out of fashion.
No, they're not.
Okay, all right. Again, pointing to practices in the Republic. After the institution of the Republic, remember that membership in the Senate was no longer hereditary. It was instead a selected body. The Senate was made up of selected individuals, and to pre-qualify for being chosen as senator, you had to have completed your term as quaestor. Okay. Can we move on? I know this is new for only a couple people, so I'm going to go ahead and advance it, if I can, to the next official step in the cursus honorum, that being the office of praetor. Again, fewer individuals elected for this higher position, 8. Again, their term was for 1 year. They were elected annually. And this office was elected by the entire centuriate assembly, because this office, had with it it was the lowest office to contain with it imperium. Remember, imperium, as I defined it yesterday, was the power of life or death over Roman citizens, whether by commanding them in war or by potentially taking away their lives if they're found guilty of a crime. And the Romans didn't want a subgroup of the population gathering to choose the praetors, so the assembly, which incorporated every single citizen, the centuriate assembly, was the assembly used to elect these individuals. As the Republic went on, the primary responsibility of the praetor was overseeing the judicial system. That's described in some detail here. However, one praetor in particular, jumping down to the bottom, called the urban praetor, was given the role of ensuring the military safety and stability of the city of Rome if Rome was ever left by the 2 consuls. If the 2 consuls had to go off to distant battles, to distant wars, the urban praetor was left in charge with a group of soldiers that became known as the Praetorian Guard. Later on, after the end of the Republic, the Praetorian Guard was repurposed from defending the city, do you guys know, to defending the emperor. Yeah, this was after the end of the Republic. The Praetorian Guard was repurposed into a bodyguard for the emperor. Joey.
So what's the baskets just for like decoration? Like this is like to show, or they actually like pick up like people with the stakes and that?
So the Foscase, I'm just going to quickly zip back to that slide for a moment, and then I will bring it back to the Praetor slide. The Foscase, the bundle of rods surrounding an axe, it was symbolic. Okay. The Romans, when they did administer physical punishment, let's say puncture, physical punishment, they didn't use the rods in the Foscase. They wouldn't unwrap them and then whack Joey and then put the back and tie it up. They would, for physical punishment, usually use whips. Okay. But this was symbolic of the ability, the rods in here, symbolic of physical punishment. Similarly, the death penalty, symbolized here by the axe, wasn't normally administered by beheading with an axe. The Romans they used a variety of means of execution. We've already talked about what happened to citizens who killed their fathers. Haven't we talked about that? Oh, I didn't tell you? Really? I didn't tell you that a citizen who killed his father was sewn into a leather bag with a rooster, a dog, a snake, and a monkey. They were sewn into a leather bag and thrown into the Tiber River, so that as slowly the water seeped into the sack, the animals, who were already quite upset, began panicking and biting and tearing and ripping the father killer apart. And if the animals didn't finish the job, he drowned. Traders, yeah, a leather sack. No, they'd take, you know what a bag is?
Yes.
Okay. So imagine a suitcase made out of leather. Okay. You're bound, your hands and feet are bound, and you're put inside the sack. A snake is dropped in. A dog. No, you're sewn inside within the bag. You're not stitched into the leather. Okay? Okay. But the Romans had other forms of execution. Manual strangulation was a popular one. But that was usually reserved for foreign enemies of Rome, who, after being paraded through a triumphal procession, they were executed, and it was usually by having a large, hairy individual strangle them. Okay. There's also the good old throwing off the Tarpeian rock, used for traitors. Okay. So you're taken to the Capitoline Hill, that rock where Tarpeia's body, after she was beaten by the Sabine shields and her body fell to the rocks below, that's where the Romans propelled traitors to their death. Okay. Well, okay. Can we move on? Okay. So, the Foscase are emblematic of, again, notice them here in Colorado's seal. They're emblematic of the government's power, or the Roman magistrates' power to punish Roman citizens even to the point of death. But they were symbolic. Okay? And we use them as symbolic of the government's authority to enforce laws. Okay, I want to emphasize again the difference in the minimum age between the quaestor and the praetor. Basically, if you were elected quaestor at 31, there was an 8-year waiting period before you could run for praetor. Why? Because I don't know actually quite too many 32-year-olds who are totally experienced and awesomely possessed of good judgment. And so the Romans said, let that ex-quaestor serve in the Senate, come to understand our laws and precedents better, serve as a jury member on a few juries before becoming praetor, when he will assemble juries and preside over trials. Onwards. On to the consul, a slide you guys did not see yesterday. You did? Oh, okay. Yeah, that's right, except it was super quick. Sorry. Once again, this was an office which possessed imperium, but as the highest elected office in the land of Rome, or in Rome's territory, There were only two. There were two, again, to prevent, I don't want to say to prevent, but to create a balance between the authority of the position and the ambitions of any single individual. The Romans did not want a situation where they had one chief official who could try to become king again, because the Romans had had enough of kings. They were elected by the centuriate assembly, and in all things, both civilian and military, the consuls' will, okay, their authority, not their will, their authority was greatest. They could overrule a praetor. Okay. As a sign of the power invested in those office holders, they convened meetings of the Senate, and the two consuls had the privilege of speaking first on how to respond to a crisis or how to create new laws. By the way, the consuls alternated by month which one was in charge of the meetings of the Senate. So if Joy and Emma were the consuls, which is unreal because they're not male as far as Rome is concerned, but I can see them being very capable leaders in our country. Joy would be the presiding consul in January, but when January is over, Emma would be the presiding consul, and it'd alternate through the year. They convened meetings of the centuriate assembly when it was time to approve laws or elect new officials. And again, they were accompanied by those bodyguards, the lictors, holding the bundle of the fasces. But because the consuls were more powerful than the praetors, they had more lictors. I know we touched on this yesterday, but I'm going to go ahead and repeat it because I like the sound of my own voice. Just kidding. The minimum age for election was 42. Some people who were perfectly wonderful as praetors might, if they solved a crisis really, really well, okay, or managed the court system very capably, or defended Rome in times of enemy attack when the consuls were away, would have developed the leadership skills and the popularity, if I may use such a word, to run for consul the next year. But, as a reminder, the Romans felt that no one who was currently holding elected office should also be a candidate for office. And so the minimum age qualification was a way of saying there has to be a year off, a way of reinforcing the fact that there had to be a year off from holding elected office between when a person was praetor and when they could be consul, so that with a year off, they could campaign as a candidate without distracting from their governmental responsibilities. Now, again, you guys were here yesterday. Was that something that was constitutionally mandated, or was it something else? It was a tradition. Yes, okay, those of you who are musically inclined want to fiddler on the roof and say tradition. Okay. It was a tradition, and like most traditions, it got thrown out the window in times of, crisis, and also in times when certain charismatic people had enough popularity to ignore tradition. All right, any other questions on the consuls? Yes.
I still don't know what they do.
Okay, so,
They consult the Senate.
all right, so the consuls get wind that large hairy Gauls are migrating southward. Merchants who have come to Rome from southern France have said, there's war in the air. There is an invading group of Gauls moving from northern France south, and our rumor mill tells us that they're intending to invade Italy. The consuls hear that. Guess what they do? They consult the Senate. They say, we have evidence from merchants that large hairy Gauls are prepared to invade Italy, potentially posing a threat. Do we take action now? If we do, what action do we take? Or do we delay taking action until we send a scout ship up to investigate, a ship and scouts up to investigate further? Do we send an army to the field? When the Senate makes its decision, the consuls act. And if the decision is, yes, we need to send scouts to go look for the enemy, or the Gauls, the consuls choose the scouts, equip them, send them off, and wait for the report. If the response is, it's time to put an army in northern Italy, guess who does that? The consuls. Okay. They're the executive branch. Okay. Think about how many consuls were involved in the Punic Wars. Okay. The guy who lost the battle at Cannae, Terentius Varro, was consul. He was in command of Rome's armies at the Battle of Cannae, given the job of destroying Hannibal, and guess what? Next year, who was elected consul? Quintus Fabius Maximus Cunctator, who persuades the Senate to approve a plan of delaying. Okay, and so he consults the Senate, but he has to get their approval to adopt the strategy of delay that ultimately proves successful. Who proposes the plan to invade Africa? You guys remember? Marcus Attilius Regulus. No, the first invasion of Africa in the First Punic War. Guess what position he held when he proposed it? Consul. So do you see how the consuls act in a military context?
They're more military than anything else.
Well, okay, only because that's what we've primarily focused on. But let us put it in terms that we have talked about a little bit. The plebs withdraws from the city of Rome. Who's going to convene the Senate to address the fact that there are no more plebeians around? The consuls. But as it happened in that particular instance with the secession of the plebs, the two consuls were in disagreement about what to do. And so was the Senate. There was no unified opinion about how to respond to the secession of the plebs. So the consuls were ineffective because the Senate couldn't decide. Consuls are not supposed to just take independent action unless there's an immediate, do or die situation. And so what did the Senate choose to do since the consuls were in disagreement and they themselves were in disagreement? Yeah, the Senate chose a dictator. They chose to ignore the traditional powers of the consul and elect a dictator. Now that was an extreme crisis of civilian government, but there were plenty of times when the government needed to decide, okay, should we pass a law? Let's put it like this. Okay. You guys remember what happened to ex-praetors and ex-consuls? No, that was ex-quaestors. Ex-praetors and ex-consuls, usually they became governors of distant provinces, right? Who do you think led that discussion? The consuls. Okay. When it came to be a matter of changing a law that prevented, let's say this is one that you guys would all understand, a law that prevented Roman citizens from killing their children. Because your children, would you want to have your parents have the legal authority to kill you? No. Okay. But remember, guys, early on in Rome's history, again, I'm counting on the fact that you got this in Latin 1, the concept of patria potestas, the authority that a father had to put a child who disgraced him to death, or in situations where the family was poor and starving, and I can't afford to feed my son JB, okay? A much better solution than keeping him around and watching him starve to death is to sell him into slavery. Because I get money to buy food for the rest of my family, and hopefully JB's future master is able to feed him. Mrs. Young's pretty nice. She'll probably feed you. Okay.
Killed my master. All the slave people in Rome, and then I become consul and kill everybody.
Okay.
My dad.
All right.
Wrong for that.
So can we can we when Rome revised its laws to prevent fathers from having automatic rights to kill or sell their children into slavery, okay, the consuls led that discussion. Do you understand? Okay. All right. Let's move on. Okay, the other magistracies. This was something hinted at, well, not hinted at, it was discussed indirectly, incompletely in the discussion of the succession of the plebs. I want you guys to know that this office is outside the strict definition of the cursus honorum because it was only open to plebeians. It wasn't open to people of senatorial status, okay, or patrician birth. The tribune of the plebs was that position that was created after the secession of the plebs. 10 men held that office each year to protect and advance the interests of the plebeian class as a whole. Tribunes had two powers, which we discussed super quickly in the secession of the plebs discussion. They had the power of the veto, to stand up in a meeting of the Senate and say, veto, I forbid. And when a tribune said, veto, I forbid, that law that was under discussion could not be advanced. Also is the embedded in that is the concept of sacrosanctitas, or sometimes referred to as sacrosanctus, which means the body, the physical body of a tribune is considered holy, sacred, and off limits to violence. Yes. Because if I fear that you are picking on Peter too much, okay, and I make him inviolable, if I give him sacrosanctitas, if you pick on him and abuse him physically, the punishment for that for you is death.
How would they call that?
Okay. I don't know how people who violated the sacrosanctity of tribunes, I don't know how their punishment was administered. Sorry. Despite what you might think about me, I am not that creepily obsessed with forms of execution. Okay? Right? Let's just say that theoretically it involved a paper shredder. Just kidding. And I said theoretically, let's just say, okay? Or imagine that it involved locking that person in a room with Owen after Owen hadn't eaten for 3 weeks.
Guys.
Okay, guys. Again, this is the powers of the tribune are defined. And do you guys remember why the sacrosanctity is important? Yes?
Well, I just remember, like, you said if the person was in front of them, they could protect them. So then they wanted the tribune of the plebs so that plebeians would go back to Rome instead of staying above ground. But something about being sacrosanct where the king called that
Sort of. Or more particularly, if we want to put you on trial, but Charles is sacrosanct and chooses to protect you, okay, he can place himself physically between the arresting officer and the intended arrestee and physically prevent the arrest of plebeians, so that political persecution was much less likely to happen. Hello. Back to the recording. In addition to the specific powers of the tribunes, this gave an opening for plebeians. Remember, lower class Romans, not a lot of political experience, not a lot of name recognition, not a lot of money. It gave them a way to establish, at the very least, name recognition and a reputation for effectiveness. that many plebeians eventually used to step into the cursus honorum. It took a long time, centuries, for Rome to loosen up enough to allow plebeians to become consuls and so on, but it did begin to happen, partly because lower class people could gain access to opportunities to prove their worth in this office. Yes, sir.
With the sacro sign to cast, does that mean that like, if they guard someone and then they leave, is that person still covered?
No, it has to be, the tribune has to be physically there.
Okay.
All right, again, outside the cursus honorum, outside the necessary parts of the cursus honorum, is the position of aedilus. Aedilus comes from the Latin word ides, which means building. Ides is a generic term that means building. There were 4 aediles. Originally, they were all patrician, but the consuls, Joey, secured passage of a law that required that of the 4 aediles late in the Republic, of the 4 aediles, only 2 of them could be patrician and 2 of them had to be plebeian. Okay. So that again created a way for people of originally plebeian family to gain access to higher levels of political engagement. And I say it was a sidestep in the cursus honorum because not everybody chose to hold it. Yeah, I can't talk. Not everybody chose to hold it because it required 2 things: tons of money, because essentially you were funding huge amounts of public projects, whether it was buildings, maintenance of roads, providing grain for a starving population in times of famine. And that money came out of your own pocket, not out of the government treasury. And also, a number of people were able, through their name recognition, through their popularity at the time, through their experience, to just catapult themselves straight up into the position of praetor and then consul. Yes? Well, if you are willing to go deeply into debt, if you had an alliance of political supporters who were willing to loan you money to use during your time of idleship, with the understanding that later on, as you rose higher in politics, you'd make that money back and pay them, it was possible. Your name is everywhere. There are going to be games on Thursday and Friday. Beasts will be slaughtered. Okay? Paid for by Peter Sloggy. And when the games are held, you'll be there in the front row seats. Everyone will be speaking to you, congratulating you on your excellent games. If you construct a temple, a new temple, to, let's say, to the god, why not, the god Cole? Okay. Everyone's going to know that it's Cole's temple because his sculptures will be on it, but everybody will know that you paid for it because your name is going to be on it. Peter Salagi built this temple for Cole. Okay. Can we push on? Yes. Yeah, equestrians could jump into this at any particular time.